I think he's really getting close to what I'm looking for. For example, the beginning of Beethoven's Seventh. Right from the start, you can feel that it's very mellow, but very precise. That is to say, the attack is very clean, and in the low notes, you can hear... It's all there.
In the 18th and 19th centuries, violin makers also refused to simply turn out duplicates of older instruments. The violin-making school of Cremona has kept the results of their research in its storerooms. A cubist violin, a violin without F-holes, with lateral F-holes, with F-holes in the form of a G-clef, a trapezoidal violin. These experiments all pose the same question. Is it possible to establish a relationship between the sonority and the form of the instrument?
Cioè mi chiedete se si sente la forma del violino del suono.
That brings us back to what you asked me. If one can hear the shape of the violin in the sound. Let me try to put the question in scientific terms. That would be like saying, if you play a skin-covered drum, can you hear if the drum is round or some different shape? It took 10 years to solve this problem scientifically. And the answer is no. You cannot, by analyzing the sound, that is to say, interpreting its qualities subjectively, reconstruct the origin and shape of the instrument.
The violin is obviously a much more complex instrument than a drum. But according to the acousticians of the Cremona school, it's not possible to identify a violin by the sound it produces. The same sound can be emitted by two instruments of different shapes. Given this conclusion, the very idea of an ideal shape makes no sense. So how can one explain the unshakable reputation of a Stradivarius violin? Should we look into the life history of these instruments that were once owned by European princes and the most renowned soloists? Try to find which one of these histories gave birth to the legend. Perhaps take a look at the history of the Messiah, a violin bought by a French violin maker, Jean-Baptiste Vuillaume, from Tarisio, an Italian dealer.
Vuillaume relates that every year Tarisio would promise him an extraordinary violin with a quality so magnificent that no one had ever heard anything like it before. This violin, this Stradivarius, he would bring it next year. So when Tarisio died, Vuillaume rushed to Milan and got there 2 days after his death. He went into Tarisio's little room, which was over an inn. And in this very poor room, Tarisio lived very simply, he found several violins, one of which was an extraordinary untouched instrument with an amazingly pure varnish. And that was the Messiah that he had been waiting for so long. He brought it back to his home and placed it in a display case in his workshop. There he held visits and would relate the story of the violin. So I think that Vuillaume was one of the persons who created the legend, and he told and retold this story and embellished it as much as he could, all the while making identical copies that were absolutely magnificent. Worn varnish, identical, but that looked used. So the old violin became the one you just had to have.
Down through the centuries, the anecdotes and stories accumulate and the legend grows. Pierre Amoyal's violin once belonged to the Tsar of Russia. During the 1917 revolution, Paul Kochanski, the violinist of Stravinsky, took it with him when he and Arthur Rubinstein, the famous pianist, fled the country. When the two men were arrested by the revolutionaries, Paul Kochanski had the idea of playing the Internationale for their captors. So, thanks to the Stradivarius, they were set free. But there's more to the history of this violin. Its legend grew with another episode.
The person who was after the violin was watching and jumped into my car. I saw the car taking off with my violin, and I felt like my life had been turned upside down and my body turned to water. It was pure horror.
Pierre Amoyal went for months without any news of his companion. But his Stradivarius brought bad luck to the thief. The man was found dead a few months later with a bullet in his head. The musician then hired a private detective and thus began a treasure hunt between Turin, Genoa, and Milan. 4 years later, after long drawn-out negotiations with the mafia, Pierre Amoyal finally recovered his violin.
When it was stolen, I realized that I loved it even more than I thought, because despite all the wonderful violins I'd played, that's the one I missed. Yes, I'd have had to say that it's something like being in love, and each one gives as much to the other. Because you know that a Stradivarius violin that's played badly or mistreated loses its tone quality after a few months. Often when violin makers see my violin land on their workbench, they tell me, "You two are happy with each other," and it shows. But it can be heard in the sound as well. I always ask him if it went well for him, what he thought of the concert that we had just performed together.
And what did he answer?
Well, he's happy, it went well. I've played so many concerts with this violin. We've had extremely moving moments together, overwhelming emotions. Wood is a living material, and the genius of Stradivarius, who impregnated this wood with his life, his craftsmanship, his soul, all that means that this violin listens. It doesn't merely play. It listens, and it lets me know that it has heard many things.
Science may be able to investigate the sound qualities of an instrument, but it cannot grasp the relationship between a violin and the musician. Perhaps that's where the mystery lies, in the secret complicity that binds the two protagonists of a piece of music. In the sounds that are created through the work of rehearsal and that are offered to the public at the time of performance. In this learning and mutual exchange process, such that certain specialists claim that the sounds are not produced by the violin, but by the violinist him or herself.